On a September afternoon in 1845 in rural Georgia, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah ran through the cotton fields to find her father, a man named Thomas, who was working as part of a harvest crew, and she screamed words that would change everything. "Papa, they're whipping Mama. The overseer, he's killing her." Thomas dropped the cotton he had been picking and ran toward the main house where his wife Clara had been working as a house servant. What he found when he arrived was his wife of 12 years tied to a post in the yard behind the plantation house, her back torn open by a whip that the overseer continued to swing despite Clara having already lost consciousness from pain and blood loss. The overseer, a man named Jacob Morrison, who was known for his cruelty, even by the standards of men who made their living supervising enslaved people, laughed when he saw Thomas approaching and told him to go back to the fields if he did not want the same treatment. Thomas did not go back to the fields. Instead, he did something that enslaved men almost never did, because doing it meant certain death. He attacked Morrison with his bare hands, beat him so severely that the overseer would be hospitalized for weeks, freed Clara from the post and carried her to the slave quarters, and then barricaded himself and his family in their cabin while the plantation owner and other white authorities decided what to do with him. What happened over the next 3 days would become one of the most discussed incidents of slave resistance in Georgia history, an incident that would force a reckoning with questions about how much abuse enslaved people could be expected to endure before fighting back, and about what happened when the fear that kept the slave system functioning finally broke. Before we descend into Thomas's story of a father's rage and a system's vulnerability, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we document the moments when oppressed people fought back, regardless of consequences. Thomas was born enslaved in South Carolina around 1810 and was sold to Georgia in the late 1820s after his first owner died and the estate was liquidated. He ended up at Oakwood Plantation, owned by a man named Richard Whitmore, who operated a mid-sized cotton plantation with approximately 80 enslaved workers. Thomas was a field hand, strong and capable, valued for his ability to work long hours in brutal heat and for his apparent docility that made overseers trust him not to cause problems. In 1833, Thomas married Clara, who had been born at Oakwood and who worked primarily in the plantation house as a servant to Whitmore's wife and daughters. The marriage was a slave marriage without legal standing, but it was recognized within the enslaved community and was tacitly accepted by Whitmore, who generally allowed enslaved people to form families because he believed that people with family ties are less likely to run away or rebel. Thomas and Clara had 3 children: Sarah, born in 1838, a son named James, born in 1840, and another daughter named Ruth, born in 1843. By all accounts, Thomas was devoted to his family in ways that were remarkable even among enslaved people who generally maintained strong family bonds despite the system's constant efforts to destroy those bonds through sales and separations. He worked extra hours to earn small amounts that he used to buy fabric for clothes for his children and treats for his wife. He told stories and sang songs to his children in the evenings after the day's labor was done. He tried to shield his family from the worst aspects of slavery, while knowing that his power to protect them was severely limited by his status as property rather than as a person with rights. Clara's position as a house servant gave her certain advantages compared to field workers, including somewhat better food, lighter physical labor, and proximity to the plantation house's relative comforts. But it also exposed her to different dangers, particularly the constant scrutiny and unpredictable tempers of the white family she served, and the vulnerability to sexual exploitation that all enslaved women faced, but that was especially acute for those working in close proximity to white men. Clara navigated these dangers successfully for over a decade, developing a reputation as a skilled and reliable servant who anticipated needs and who avoided giving offense that might provoke punishment. But in August 1845, The dynamics at Oakwood Plantation shifted with the hiring of Jacob Morrison as the new overseer. Morrison had been fired from his previous position at another plantation for excessive brutality, though this history was either unknown to Whitmore or was considered unimportant compared to Morrison's reputation for maximizing crop production through intimidation and violence. Morrison believed that enslaved people worked harder when they feared him, and he made himself feared through unpredictable violence and through public displays of cruelty designed to terrorize the entire enslaved community into submission. Within weeks of his arrival, multiple enslaved people had been whipped for minor infractions or for no reason at all. Morrison made particular targets of people who he perceived as having too much independence or self-respect, people whose spirits he wanted to break to demonstrate his absolute power. Clara became Morrison's target for reasons that were never entirely clear, but that appeared to involve his perception that she had too much status within the enslaved community, and too much access to the white family, both of which Morrison saw as threats to his authority. He began finding fault with her work, claiming that she was lazy or disrespectful, complaints that Whitmore's wife dismissed because she was satisfied with Clara's service. But Morrison's harassment escalated, and in early September 1845, he accused Clara of stealing food from the plantation house, an accusation that Clara denied and that had no evidence supporting it. Morrison demanded that Whitmore authorize punishment, arguing that allowing Clara to escape consequences for theft would encourage other enslaved people to steal. Whitmore, who generally deferred to his overseers in matters involving enslaved people, and who did not want to undermine Morrison's authority, authorized a whipping of 20 lashes, a severe punishment, but not unusual by the standards of plantation discipline. But Morrison, either through genuine belief that Clara deserved worse, or through simple sadistic pleasure, exceeded the authorized punishment dramatically. On September 15, 1845, Morrison tied Clara to a post in the yard behind the plantation house and began whipping her with a bullwhip designed for controlling livestock, a weapon far more severe than the standard whips used for punishing enslaved people. He continued whipping Clara long after the authorized 20 lashes, eventually delivering over 60 strikes that tore through her clothing and skin, causing massive bleeding and eventually rendering her unconscious. The other enslaved people working near the plantation house that afternoon could hear Clara's screams and could see what Morrison was doing, but they were powerless to intervene without risking similar or worse punishment themselves. The white family inside the house heard the commotion, but apparently chose not to interfere, either because they trusted Morrison's judgment about appropriate discipline, or because they were indifferent to Clara's suffering. 7-year-old Sarah was playing near the slave quarters when she heard her mother screaming, and despite the danger, she ran toward the plantation house to see what was happening. When she saw Morrison whipping her mother and saw the blood and the way Clara's body hung limply from the post, Sarah ran to find her father. Thomas was in the cotton fields about a quarter-mile from the house, and when his daughter found him with her desperate message, he faced a choice that every enslaved man dreaded: submit to the system's violence against his family or resist and face certain death. For Thomas, there was no real choice. He could not stand by while his wife was murdered. The consequences of resistance were irrelevant compared to the impossibility of doing nothing. Thomas ran from the cotton field toward the plantation house, with Sarah trying to keep up and other enslaved workers watching in shock because they recognized that what Thomas was about to do would change everything. Morrison was still whipping Clara when Thomas arrived, and the overseer's reaction to seeing Thomas was not fear but contempt. Morrison told Thomas to return to his work, or face the whip himself, apparently confident that Thomas would obey, because enslaved men always obeyed when faced with white authority backed by violence. But Thomas did not obey. He charged at Morrison with a fury that surprised the overseer, who barely had time to turn before Thomas's fists connected with his face. Thomas was larger and stronger than Morrison, advantages he had never been able to use because using them would have meant death. But now that death was certain anyway, he used every ounce of his strength. He knocked Morrison to the ground and continued beating him, ignoring the overseer's attempts to fight back and ignoring the shocked shouts of white people who were emerging from the plantation house. Thomas beat Morrison until the overseer stopped moving and appeared dead or near death, his face a mass of blood and broken bones, his body curled in a defensive position that had failed to protect him from Thomas's rage. When Thomas finally stopped hitting Morrison, he turned to his wife. Clara was still tied to the post, unconscious, her back destroyed by the whipping. Thomas untied her with shaking hands, lifted her as gently as he could, despite her weight and his own exhaustion, and carried her away from the plantation house toward the slave quarters. White people were shouting behind him, and he could hear someone running to get guns, but Thomas did not run or hide. He walked slowly and deliberately through the plantation, carrying his unconscious wife, with his 7-year-old daughter following behind him crying. Other enslaved people watched from their work positions, not interfering, but also not helping the white authorities who were organizing a response. Thomas took Clara to the cabin his family occupied, a small single-room structure that he shared with his wife and 3 children, and that was identical to the dozens of other cabins that housed Oakwood's enslaved community. He laid Clara on the bed, examined her injuries, which were horrific, and began trying to treat her wounds with water and cloth strips that he tore from their limited clothing supplies. Then he barricaded the cabin door with the furniture and tools available to him and waited for what he knew was coming. The immediate response from the plantation owner and other white authorities was confused and uncertain, demonstrating how thoroughly Thomas's actions had violated the scripts that governed slave society. An enslaved man had attacked and nearly killed a white overseer. The prescribed response to such an act was immediate execution, either through formal legal process or through extrajudicial violence by white mobs. But several factors complicated this straightforward response. First, Morrison's excessive and unauthorized whipping of Clara was itself a violation of norms, even by the brutal standards of slave discipline. Whitmore had authorized 20 lashes, and Morrison had delivered over 60, nearly killing Clara in the process. This created ambiguity about who was actually at fault for the crisis. Second, Thomas had not attempted to escape or to incite other enslaved people to rebellion. He had barricaded himself in his cabin with his family, making it clear that he was not planning violence against anyone else, but that he would resist attempts to remove him by force. Third, removing Thomas from the cabin by force would likely require killing him and possibly his entire family, including his young children. And even by 1845 standards, such a public execution was problematic and would create divisions within white society about whether it was justified. And fourth, there was a recognition that executing Thomas for defending his wife might create resentment and potential resistance among the other enslaved people at Oakwood, who had all witnessed Clara's brutal whipping and who might see Thomas's actions as justified, even if they could not say so publicly. Richard Whitmore faced a dilemma that exposed contradictions at the heart of the slave system. Slavery depended on absolute white authority and on the credible threat that any resistance would be met with overwhelming violence. Allowing Thomas to attack a white overseer and then to defy authority by barricading himself in his cabin without facing immediate death would undermine that authority and might encourage other enslaved people to believe they could resist without facing consequences. But executing Thomas would create its own problems, particularly given that Morrison's whipping had exceeded authorized limits and had nearly killed Clara. Whitmore spent September 15th consulting with other plantation owners, with the county sheriff, and with relatives about how to handle the situation. No consensus emerged, with some arguing for immediate violent assault on Thomas's cabin, and others arguing for a more measured approach that would avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and that would acknowledge that Morrison bore some responsibility for creating the crisis. As night fell on September 15th, Thomas remained barricaded in his cabin with his family. Clara remained unconscious from her injuries, and white authorities had made no move to forcibly remove him, despite having the weapons and manpower to do so. The enslaved community at Oakwood responded to Thomas's action with a complex mix of fear, admiration, and strategic calculation. Everyone recognized that Thomas had done something extraordinary and dangerous, that he had struck back against that oppressed them all, that he had demonstrated that white power was not invincible, and that enslaved people could fight back if they were willing to accept the consequences. But everyone also recognized that Thomas would likely die for what he had done, and that his death would be brutal and would be intended to terrorize other enslaved people into never attempting similar resistance. The question facing the community was whether to support Thomas actively, which might mean joining in resistance that could lead to mass violence and executions, or whether to remain passive and let Thomas face his fate alone. For the first day and night of the standoff, the community chose a middle path. They did not actively support Thomas or attempt to defend his cabin, but they also did not help white authorities in any way, and they maintained a solidarity of silence and passive resistance that made clear their sympathies lay with Thomas rather than with Morrison or the white authorities. The second day of the standoff, September 16th, brought developments that surprised everyone involved. Clara regained consciousness in the morning, though she was in severe pain from her injuries, and was likely to have permanent damage to her back and likely permanent scars from the whipping. Her survival was significant because it meant that Morrison had not actually killed her, which slightly reduced the severity of Thomas's offense in the eyes of some white observers who might have seen killing an overseer to prevent a murder as more justifiable than attacking an overseer for excessive but non-fatal punishment. Thomas sent his daughter Sarah out of the cabin with a message for Whitmore. He would surrender himself and face whatever consequences were decided, but only if Whitmore guaranteed that Clara and their children would not be sold away as punishment, and that they would be protected from further violence by Morrison or anyone else. This message created a new dynamic in the standoff because it demonstrated that Thomas was not defying authority indefinitely, but was trying to negotiate terms for his surrender, and it forced Whitmore and other white authorities to decide whether they would negotiate with an enslaved man who had attacked a white overseer, or whether they would reject negotiation as inconsistent with maintaining white authority. The debate among white authorities about whether to negotiate with Thomas revealed deep divisions about how slavery should be managed, and about how to balance the need to maintain absolute authority with the practical recognition that excessive violence against enslaved people could create instability and resistance. Some plantation owners and local officials argued that negotiating with Thomas was impossible because it would establish a precedent that enslaved people could attack overseers and then negotiate rather than facing immediate execution. They insisted that Thomas must be removed from his cabin by force, if necessary, and must be executed publicly to restore the fear that kept the slave system functioning. Others argued that such a dramatic response was unnecessary and potentially counterproductive, that Thomas had acted in defense of his wife, whose whipping had exceeded authorized levels, and that allowing him to surrender in exchange for protection for his family would resolve the situation without unnecessary violence and without creating a martyr who might inspire future resistance. Whitmore himself was caught between these positions, wanting to maintain his authority and to support his overseer, but also recognizing that Morrison had created the crisis through excessive violence, and that executing Thomas might alienate the enslaved workers whose labor was essential to the plantation's operations. On the evening of September 16th, Whitmore sent a message to Thomas through a trusted enslaved man who Thomas knew and respected. The message offered a compromise. Thomas would be punished for attacking Morrison, but the punishment would not be death and would not involve physical torture. He would be sold to a different plantation, probably in a different state, meaning he would be separated from his family, but would not be executed. Clara and the children would remain at Oakwood and would not be further punished for Thomas's actions. Morrison would be sent away from Oakwood to recover from his injuries and would not be allowed to return, which was as close as Whitmore could come to acknowledging that the overseer bore responsibility for the crisis. If Thomas accepted these terms, he would surrender the next morning and would be transferred to a slave trader who would take him away immediately. If he rejected the terms, Whitmore would order an assault on the cabin, and Thomas would be killed along with anyone who resisted. Thomas had until morning to decide, and Whitmore made clear that this offer was final, and that no further negotiation would be possible. Thomas faced an impossible choice during that night of September 16th to 17th. Surrender meant separation from his family, likely permanent since he would be sold to a distant location, and since enslaved families had no legal means to maintain contact or to reunite after sales separated them. He would never see his children grow up, never be able to protect his wife from future dangers, never be part of the family he had built despite slavery's efforts to destroy it. But surrender also meant that Clara and the children would survive and would not be sold away, that they would have a chance to continue their lives, and that he would not die in an assault that might also kill them if they were caught in the violence. Resistance meant almost certain death for himself, and possibly for his entire family, but it would mean that he did not submit to a system that demanded submission after what it had done to Clara. The choice was between impossible options, the kind of choice that slavery forced on people constantly, where every path led to suffering, and where the only question was which form of suffering was least unbearable. Thomas made his decision sometime during that long night, holding his children and speaking quietly with Clara, who was still in pain from her injuries. The decision he made would shape how his family and his community remembered him, and would influence how the enslaved people at Oakwood thought about resistance and submission in the years that followed. On the morning of September 17th, as white authorities were preparing for the assault on Thomas's cabin if he refused to surrender, Thomas opened the cabin door and walked out with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He had agreed to Whitmore's terms. Clara and the children stood in the cabin doorway, watching as Thomas was taken by white men who bound his hands and led him toward where a slave trader was waiting with a cart that would take him away. Thomas did not resist and did not speak except to tell his children that he loved them and to tell Clara to be strong. The entire scene was witnessed by dozens of enslaved people who had gathered despite attempts to keep them away, people who had heard about what Thomas had done and who wanted to see what would happen to a man who had dared to fight back against an overseer. Thomas was loaded into the trader's cart and was taken away from Oakwood Plantation that same morning, sold to a trader who would transport him to the deep south, where he would likely end up on a cotton or sugar plantation, where conditions were even harsher than what he had experienced in Georgia. He would never see his family again. That much was certain. What was uncertain was whether his action and his willingness to surrender on terms that protected his family would be remembered as courage or as submission, as victory or as defeat. The aftermath of Thomas's removal from Oakwood Plantation revealed the complexity of how enslaved communities interpreted and responded to acts of resistance. On one hand, Thomas had done what almost no enslaved man did. He had attacked a white overseer in defense of his family and had survived long enough to negotiate terms for his surrender. He had not been tortured or executed. His family had been protected. Morrison had been sent away and would not return to brutalize other enslaved people. These outcomes were unprecedented and represented a kind of victory, even if that victory came at the enormous cost of Thomas's separation from his family. Many enslaved people at Oakwood saw Thomas's actions as heroic and saw the outcome as demonstrating that resistance was possible and that white authority was not absolute. The fact that Thomas had made Whitmore negotiate rather than simply executing him showed vulnerability in the system and suggested that enslaved people had more power than they had believed if they were willing to use it strategically. But others saw Thomas's surrender as confirmation that resistance was futile, that even when enslaved people fought back, they ultimately lost everything, and that Thomas's fate of being sold away from his family was a warning about the costs of defiance rather than an inspiration to resist. These different interpretations shaped how the enslaved community at Oakwood responded to subsequent injustices and influenced whether people chose submission or resistance when facing impossible situations. Clara and her children remained at Oakwood Plantation for several more years after Thomas's sale. Clara recovered physically from the whipping, though she carried the scars for the rest of her life, and she continued working as a house servant, though under a different overseer, who was instructed to avoid the kind of excessive violence that had created the crisis. She never remarried, which was unusual among enslaved people, who generally formed new families after separations, because loneliness and the practical need for partnership made remarriage common despite the pain of losing previous spouses. Her refusal to remarry was interpreted by some as loyalty to Thomas and as a form of resistance to slavery's attempts to control family formation. She raised their 3 children as well as she could within the constraints of slavery, and she apparently told them stories about their father that portrayed him as a hero who had fought for them even though it cost him everything. In 1851, 6 years after Thomas's sale, Clara and her children were themselves sold when Whitmore died and Oakwood Plantation was liquidated. They were purchased as a family unit by a buyer in Alabama, which was fortunate because enslaved families were often separated during estate sales. What happened to them after 1851 is unknown because they disappear from available historical records at that point, lost among millions of enslaved people whose individual stories were never documented or preserved. The fate of Jacob Morrison, the overseer whose excessive whipping had sparked the crisis, illustrates how white society handled the rare situations where white men's violence against enslaved people became problematic even by the standards of slave society. Morrison recovered from the beating Thomas had given him, though he suffered permanent injuries, including vision problems and facial scarring, that made him less employable as an overseer who needed to project physical dominance. He was not prosecuted for excessive violence against Clara, because such prosecution was nearly impossible under laws that gave overseers broad discretion in disciplining enslaved people. But he also found it difficult to find work as an overseer after the incident at Oakwood, because other plantation owners saw him as someone who had lost control of a situation and who had created problems for his employer. He eventually found work at a smaller plantation in southern Georgia, where he continued his pattern of excessive violence until 1849, when he was killed in another incident involving an enslaved man who attacked him. The details of that incident are not well documented, but it appears that Morrison never learned from his experience at Oakwood and continued believing that extreme violence was an effective management tool until finally that violence provoked a response he could not survive. Richard Whitmore's handling of the Thomas situation shaped his reputation among both white and black communities in ways that influenced how his plantation operated for the remaining years before his death. Among white plantation owners, Whitmore's decision to negotiate with Thomas and to remove Morrison rather than executing Thomas immediately was controversial. Some saw it as weakness that undermined white authority and that might encourage future resistance. Others saw it as shrewd management that had resolved the crisis without unnecessary bloodshed and without creating a martyr who might inspire broader resistance. Among enslaved people, Whitmore's actions created a more complex reputation than most plantation owners had. He was still a slaveholder who participated in and benefited from an evil system, but he had shown that he could be negotiated with under extreme circumstances, and that he was willing to acknowledge when his overseers exceeded reasonable limits. This reputation may have made enslaved people at Oakwood slightly less likely to attempt escapes or resistance, because they felt that Whitmore's management was more tolerable than what they might face if sold to worse owners, or it may have made them more likely to push back against excessive violence, because they had seen that such pushback could sometimes succeed. The historical record does not make clear which interpretation was more accurate. The broader implications of Thomas's case for understanding slave resistance and the functioning of the slave system are significant. Thomas's action demonstrated that even the most carefully controlled and terrorized enslaved people would fight back when pushed beyond a certain point, that the fear that kept the system functioning could break under sufficient provocation, and that when it broke, white authority was more vulnerable than white society wanted to acknowledge. The fact that Thomas was able to barricade himself in his cabin for 3 days and to negotiate terms for his surrender showed that white authority depended partly on enslaved people choosing not to resist rather than on white people having absolute power to prevent resistance. If enslaved people decided to fight back despite the costs, the system could not function, which was why white society invested so heavily in maintaining fear and in making examples of anyone who resisted. Thomas's case also demonstrated that enslaved communities were constantly evaluating the costs and benefits of submission versus resistance, that they were strategic actors rather than passive victims, and that their choices about whether to resist actively or to resist passively or to submit were based on rational calculations about what's possible and what prices they were willing to pay. Understanding these dynamics is essential for understanding both how slavery functioned and how it was eventually challenged and defeated. The recovery of Thomas's story was difficult because, like many incidents of slave resistance, it was poorly documented by authorities who had reasons to suppress evidence of how vulnerable the system was to challenge. The primary sources that allowed historians to reconstruct what happened included plantation records that mentioned Thomas's sale, legal documents related to Morrison's treatment and his later death, and most importantly, oral traditions preserved by descendants of the enslaved community at Oakwood Plantation, who had passed down stories about the man who beat an overseer to defend his wife, and who negotiated his own terms for surrender. These oral traditions were collected by historians in the 20th century as part of broader efforts to document enslaved people's experiences and resistance, and they provided details about the incident that would never have been preserved in official records. The story of Thomas and Clara has become part of the larger historical memory of slave resistance, cited in scholarly works about how enslaved people fought back against violence, and about the limits of white authority when enslaved people decided to challenge it. What should we remember about Thomas and Clara's story? That slavery involved violence so extreme that even people who appeared docile and submissive would fight back when their families were threatened, that the fear that maintained the system was fragile and could break, and that when it broke, the supposedly absolute power of slaveholders was revealed to be conditional and negotiable. We should remember that Thomas's choice to attack Morrison and then to negotiate terms for his surrender was not madness or lack of strategic thinking, but was a calculated decision about how to respond to an impossible situation, a decision that prioritized protecting his family over protecting himself. We should remember that Clara survived the whipping that could have killed her, and that she continued living and raising their children despite the trauma and despite Thomas's absence, demonstrating the resilience that enslaved people maintained even after experiencing devastating losses. We should remember that Sarah, the 7-year-old girl who ran to find her father and whose desperate message sparked everything that followed, had to live with the knowledge that her message had led to her father being sold away forever, and that enslaved children carried impossible burdens that no children should have to carry. And we should remember that the enslaved community at Oakwood had to decide what Thomas's actions meant and how to respond to future violence in light of what they had witnessed, and that these decisions shaped the ongoing struggle for freedom that would continue until slavery was finally abolished. Thomas's final fate is unknown beyond his sale to a Deep South plantation in September 1845. He would have been approximately 35 years old at that time, still in his physical prime and valuable as a field worker despite his age. And no evidence has been found that would allow historians to determine where Thomas ended up or when and how he died. It is possible that he survived until the Civil War ended slavery 20 years later, and that he lived to experience freedom, though the harsh conditions in Deep South plantations make this unlikely. It is equally possible that he died within years of being sold south, either from disease, overwork, or violence, without his name appearing in records from his new location, which is unlikely given how poorly such records were maintained. Thomas's individual fate remains unknown. But his action on September 15, 1845, is documented and remembered, and that action reveals truths about resistance, family, and the limits of oppression that remain relevant long after the specific individuals involved have passed from history into memory. What do you think about Thomas's decision to attack Morrison, and about his choice to surrender in exchange for protecting his family? Was his action heroic resistance, or was it a tragic mistake that cost him everything? How should we judge Clara's survival and her decision to continue living and raising their children despite the trauma and separation? And what lessons does this case hold for understanding how oppressed people decide when to resist and what prices they are willing to pay? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of a father's rage and the impossible choices faced by enslaved families challenged your understanding of slave resistance and demonstrated the humanity of people who lived under inhuman conditions, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to recovering the stories of people who fought back against oppression, even when fighting back meant losing everything, and to honoring the families who survived separations and trauma that should have destroyed them, but that they endured through resilience and love. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that enslaved people were not passive victims, but were parents and spouses who would do anything to protect their families, and who made strategic choices about resistance, even in situations where all choices were terrible. Thomas beat an overseer to defend his wife. He survived 3 days barricaded in his cabin. He negotiated terms for his surrender that protected his family. He was sold away forever and never saw them again. Remember him. Remember Clara. Remember Sarah, who ran through the fields crying for her father. Remember that slavery destroyed families, but could not destroy the love that made people fight for each other regardless of consequences. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that every act of resistance deserves to be remembered, that every family torn apart by slavery deserves to be honored, and that every impossible choice made by enslaved people reveals something essential about courage and love. Remember Thomas. Remember Clara. Remember September 15, 1845, the day a father chose to fight back.